Folks, what just unfolded in the Strait of Hormuz over the last 48 hours is not a skirmish. It's a strategic reckoning. Iran has unleashed 180 Fattah-2 hypersonic missiles in a coordinated saturation attack that has effectively crushed a major U.S. Navy presence attempting to challenge their control of the waterway. Let me be very clear. This is the moment the math of modern naval warfare caught up with Washington. These were not random launches born of desperation, but a meticulously orchestrated barrage of Mach 13 to 15 glide vehicles, each carrying maneuverable re-entry vehicles engineered over years of patient development to pierce through layered defenses like Aegis and THAAD that we in Washington had long assured ourselves would render such threats manageable. And the narrow confines of the strait, spanning just 21 to 33 miles at its most constricted points, turned what should have been a routine transit into a natural kill box, where limited maneuvering room negated the very advantages of speed and firepower our naval doctrine has preached for decades. Initial reports, corroborated by open-source intelligence and even cautious acknowledgments from regional observers, speak of at least 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and multiple support vessels within the U.S. Fifth Fleet Task Force, now crippled or sunk. A grim tally that reflects the 70% plus strike success rate claimed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in their immediate statements. All of this unfolding as the direct and foreseeable result of President Trump's aggressive revival of maximum pressure sanctions, coupled with the failed escort operation under what his administration branded Project Freedom, an effort meant to force passage through waters Iran has treated as its sovereign strategic red line for generations. Oil prices have already spiked 18% in early trading, sending ripples through global markets that remind us how tightly intertwined energy security remains with naval posturing in this choke point. And Trump's public statements, marked by a visible panic that contrasts sharply with the confident rhetoric of just days ago, suggest even his inner circle is grappling with the speed at which this miscalculation has unraveled. Having been inside the system, I can tell you that such escalations do not emerge from a vacuum, but from a pattern of hubris that has echoed through American foreign policy for far too long, where the assumption of unchallenged dominance blinds policymakers to the patient accumulation of capabilities by adversaries who have studied our playbook and rewritten it with asymmetric precision. Stay with me as we walk through precisely how we arrived at this juncture, because understanding the sequence is essential to grasping why this strike represents not an aberration, but a calculated response that has now shifted the initiative decisively. Having been inside the system, I can tell you this kind of escalation was entirely predictable and entirely avoidable. Stay with me as I walk you through exactly how we got here. When President Trump returned to office and doubled down on the maximum pressure campaign that had defined his first term, reimposing sanctions with renewed vigor and greenlighting the U.S.-led Project Freedom escort flotilla, the administration framed it as a necessary stand against Iranian adventurism, a bold move to reopen the strait and reassert freedom of navigation in waters that carry roughly 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply. Yet those of us who have spent careers analyzing the region's fault lines knew that this provocation ignored Iran's repeated public and private warnings, delivered through diplomatic back channels and military drills alike, that any attempt to muscle through their de facto control would trigger a layered defense posture blending ballistic, cruise, and now hypersonic systems honed through years of iterative testing and real-world adaptation. The task force itself, elements of a carrier strike group plus escorts transiting from the Gulf of Oman into the strait, represented the kind of forward deployment we have relied upon since the end of the Cold War, projecting power into enclosed waters where geography itself becomes an equalizer. And Iran's prior activities since March of this year, including extensive mine-laying operations, swarm boat exercises, and missile drills that showcase their growing inventory, should have served as unmistakable signals that the calculus had changed. But instead, the administration's approach rested on an underestimation of Iran's post-2024 missile rebuild, which independent assessments place at well over 3,000 ballistic and hypersonic systems ready for deployment, many of them road-mobile launchers, allowing rapid dispersal across multiple IRGC sites to complicate preemptive targeting. What comes next is where things take a serious turn. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and the pattern is depressingly familiar. Intelligence briefings that highlighted Iran's hypersonic glide vehicle countermeasures, maneuvering at terminal phases in ways that defeat radar lock and interceptor timing, were dismissed or downplayed in favor of optimistic scenarios that assumed our technological edge would hold, much as similar assessments failed to anticipate the resilience of Iraqi forces in the 1990s or the adaptability of non-state actors in the post-9/11 era. Trump's team overlooked how the Fattah-2's design, with its precision guidance and 200-kilogram warheads optimized for maritime strikes, would turn the strait's confined waters into a theater where saturation tactics overwhelm even the most sophisticated shipborne defenses. A logical progression that stems directly from years of Iranian investment in indigenous technology precisely to counter the kind of naval superiority we once took for granted. This was no impulsive reaction, but a calculated assertion of initiative, born of Tehran's recognition that patience and layered capabilities could exploit the very choke point vulnerabilities our own war games had long identified, yet failed to address in policy terms. But if you think that's the full story, it's not. What comes next is where things take a serious turn. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room. The technical superiority of the Fattah-2 in this specific environment cannot be overstated. For the Strait of Hormuz functions as a natural kill box where the limited sea room restricts the kind of evasive maneuvers that larger ocean expanses might afford a task force, forcing vessels into predictable lanes that Iranian planners have mapped with exquisite detail through decades of observation and simulation. In this latest engagement, the saturation mechanics of the 180 missile salvo, launched in waves from dispersed road-mobile platforms to create overlapping trajectories, overwhelmed the layered defenses of SM-6 interceptors, Patriot batteries ashore, and the shipborne Aegis systems that form the backbone of our naval protection, with launch-to-impact timelines compressing to under 10 minutes for many of the shorter-range vectors, a window that left American commanders with reaction times measured in seconds rather than the minutes required for effective countermeasures. The glide vehicles themselves, streaking at Mach 13 to 15 during their terminal phase while executing unpredictable maneuvers that independent technical assessments place at rendering intercept probabilities below 20%, even under optimal conditions, delivered precision strikes that reports now indicate accounted for 40 to 60 direct hits across the task force, each warhead's 200-kilogram payload exploiting the structural vulnerabilities of destroyers and support ships in ways that expose the limits of our hardening assumptions. This next part changes everything. The math is brutal, and it's all in Iran's favor. Compare this to the Iranian salvo tactics, refined in drills from 2024 through early 2026, where smaller-scale barrages already demonstrated the capacity to saturate radar horizons and exhaust interceptor magazines. And you begin to see how the narrow geography here negated the traditional advantages of a U.S. carrier air wing, with flight decks unable to launch or recover aircraft effectively amid the barrage without risking catastrophic losses. A doctrinal failure that echoes the kind of over-reliance on carrier-centric power projection we witnessed in earlier Gulf crises, yet never fully adapted away from. Having spent years advising on these very contingencies, I can attest that our naval doctrine, forged in an era of unchallenged blue water dominance, simply did not account for the convergence of hypersonic speed, maneuverability, and choke point geography that Iran has now weaponized with such devastating efficiency. turning what was intended as a show of force into a textbook illustration of how determined regional actors can impose costs that far exceed the political will to sustain them. This next part changes everything. The math is brutal, and it's all in Iran's favor. The broader operational and economic fallout from this strike extends far beyond the immediate naval losses, disrupting the flow of 21 million barrels of oil per day that routinely transited the strait before the incident, and placing Iran's control of this vital choke point on an effectively absolute footing for the foreseeable future. Tanker insurance rates are projected to jump by as much as 400% in the coming days, a figure that will cascade through global supply chains and inflate energy costs worldwide in a manner reminiscent of the 1973 oil crisis, but amplified by today's interconnected markets and just-in-time logistics that leave little margin for such shocks. U.S. allies in the region, including the UAE and Saudi Arabia, have already begun quietly distancing themselves through back-channel communications and public statements that stop short of outright condemnation, yet signal a pragmatic recalibration away from entanglement in what they now view as an unsustainable American confrontation. A realignment that underscores the fragility of our forward deployment strategy in the Gulf, where bases and assets once seen as impregnable now appear exposed to the very hypersonic threats we had assured them were containable. Trump's internal panic has manifested in emergency National Security Council sessions and a series of contradictory public statements that veer between defiance and calls for restraint, revealing the kind of internal discord that often accompanies the sudden realization that a policy built on bluster has encountered the hard limits of reality. Insider analysis drawn from patterns I observed across multiple administrations points to a profound miscalculation in ignoring long-standing warnings rooted in the kind of Wilkerson-style realism that emphasize the over-reliance on naval power projection against adversaries who have mastered the art of asymmetric denial in littoral waters, particularly when those adversaries possess integrated air defenses and coastal batteries capable of providing sustained cover for follow-on operations that could prolong the disruption indefinitely. Russia's and China's signaling of support for Iran, including diplomatic cover at the United Nations and quiet logistical assurances, further complicates any American attempt at reversal, tying this single incident into a larger pattern of great power competition where the Gulf's energy arteries become the contested terrain of multipolar realities rather than the exclusive domain of U.S. influence. The economic hemorrhage alone, with potential daily losses in the billions from halted transits and rerouted shipping, exposes how our strategic posture in the region has rested on assumptions of uninterrupted access that this barrage has now shattered, forcing a reassessment not merely of tactics, but of the entire architecture of American presence in the Middle East that has persisted since the Carter Doctrine first articulated our vital interests here. Having been inside the system, let me tell you, this is the revelation that Washington does not want you to hear. But if you think that's the full story, it's not. I have watched these games played from inside the Situation Room, and this one is different. The deepest layer of this crisis lies in the uncomfortable truth that U.S. pre-strike intelligence had detailed knowledge of Iran's Fattah-2 readiness, including assessments of their command and control integration across dispersed launch sites. Yet Trump's team chose to dismiss it as bluff and bluster, prioritizing the political optics of toughness over the cold strategic calculus that should have dictated caution. Iran's IRGC demonstrated masterful coordination in this 180 missile salvo, the largest hypersonic barrage in recorded history, leveraging indigenous over-the-horizon radar networks and drone overwatch for real-time, satellite-independent targeting that rendered our own jamming and suppression efforts largely ineffective, a technical feat that speaks to years of quiet innovation under sanctions pressure that we repeatedly underestimated. This single operation has now compelled a strategic U.S. retreat from key positions in the Gulf, with at least one carrier group withdrawing to safer waters in the Arabian Sea as damage assessments continue and the risk of follow-on strikes looms. A visible pullback that crushes any lingering illusions of quick victory or decisive dominance in the region, and ties directly into a larger historical pattern of American hubris confronting the resilient adaptability of Iranian strategy, much as we saw in the prolonged stalemates of the Iran-Iraq War, or the unforeseen quagmires that followed our own interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Trump's panic metrics are telling. Emergency calls to Gulf allies yielding lukewarm responses. A stock market reaction that erased gains accumulated under his economic narrative. And internal deliberations that now grapple with the prospect of escalation ladders, leading not to triumph, but to entrapment in a conflict where the costs accrue disproportionately to the side projecting power from afar. The revelation here is that Iran's demonstrated capacity to dictate the tempo of events in its immediate neighborhood has exposed the limits of our extended deterrence commitments, forcing a reckoning with the reality that forward-deployed assets, once symbols of strength, can become liabilities when confronted by precision fires calibrated to exploit choke point dynamics and hypersonic physics in tandem. Stay with me on this final point. What comes next is where things take a serious turn for the entire region and for American credibility worldwide. The new reality emerging from the waters of Hormuz positions Iran as the dominant power capable of dictating terms in the Persian Gulf. Not through conquest, but through the demonstrated ability to impose prohibitive costs on any challenge to its control, leaving U.S. options narrowed to the unpalatable choice between de-escalation that acknowledges Iranian red lines or a catastrophic escalation that risks drawing in broader regional and global actors with consequences measured in trillions rather than billions. Oil markets face projected long-term disruptions that could extend for weeks if follow-on Iranian operations sustain pressure on tanker traffic, with global supply chain reverberations that threaten inflation spikes, energy shortages in Europe and Asia, and political instability in import-dependent economies already strained by other geopolitical fractures. Iran's remaining arsenal, still robust despite the expenditure of this salvo, affords it the capacity to calibrate sustained pressure, a strategic depth born of its indigenous production lines and dispersed basing that contrasts sharply with the logistical vulnerabilities of our own expeditionary forces. The path forward demands a turn toward realistic diplomacy that acknowledges Tehran's core security concerns and the legitimate interests of all littoral states, rather than the unilateral diktats that have defined our approach for too long, lest we accelerate America's strategic decline in the Middle East into an irreversible isolation that leaves us sidelined in the very region where our vital interests remain most exposed. The historical parallels are instructive. Just as British naval supremacy eroded in the face of rising challengers in the early 20th century through overextension in confined seas, so too does our current posture risk a similar fate if we fail to adapt to the multipolar mathematics now at play. Trump's policies, for all their intended assertiveness, have instead hastened this shift by provoking the very capabilities they sought to suppress, underscoring how ideological rigidity can blind even the most powerful actors to the shifting sands of strategic reality. If this analysis cut through the noise for you, hit that subscribe button and the bell, because events like this are accelerating and you need the unfiltered truth. Share this with anyone still believing the old playbook works. Let me be very clear. The world just changed in Hormuz, and we must understand it. This is Lawrence Wilkerson. Stay informed, stay ahead.